and I am Associate Professor at American University in Washington, D.C., located on ancestral Piscataway land. I am honored to serve as chair and discussant for the session titled Caste, Nation, and Spatiality, which actually picks up very nicely from where we just left off. And I thank the organizers for inviting me. We have 3 speakers in this session. I'll introduce all of them. The first speaker is Srinidhi Narsiman. Shrinidhi studied history at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and completed an MPhil in modern South Asian studies at the University of Oxford, where she wrote her thesis on Tamil anti-caste movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Her paper is titled Placemaking from the Margins, Asia in the Tamil Buddhist Imagination. Next is Ganeshwar. Ganeshwar S. submitted his MPhil in political science at Delhi University. His research traces the political contours of modern regional consciousness in Tamil Nadu, particularly how it navigates the question of caste. His paper is titled Periyar Spatial Thought, Region as Non-Brahmin Discursive Space. Finally, Anish KK, who is a doctoral student at TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, School of Development Studies in Mumbai. He's completing his PhD on caste, politics, and social space in Kerala. His paper is Conceptions of Community, Nation, and Politics, the Ezhavas of South Malabar and their quest of equality. I turn it over now to Srinidhi. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna, hello, everybody. And I'm so glad to be presenting this. And I'm also very, very happy and thrilled that Dr. Gajendran Ayyadurai is here, and his own kind of doctoral work on Ayodhyadas and the Sakya Buddhist movement was really a huge inspiration behind this chapter of my thesis, as well as this paper that I'm going to present to you today. So just to start off, in the last years of the 19th century, Madras became home to a movement that anticipated Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism by nearly half a century. And the man at the heart of this movement was the scholar and Siddha physician Ayodhyadas Pandita. And he led what was essentially the first Dalit Buddhist revival of its kind in late colonial India. At the heart of this Buddhist revival was a reinterpretation of the past through the narratives of the Tamil literary canon and Tamil history, so that the Indian subcontinent came to be reimagined in Tamil, Dalit, and Buddhist terms. In this paper today, I'm going to set out the political possibilities created by these reinterpretations of the past, and argue that the Sakya Buddhist imagination of ancient India as a Dalit Buddhist land allowed the broader Buddhist world of Asia generally, and countries like Japan and Burma specifically, to come alive as as enchanted modern iterations of India's own ancient glorious Buddhist past. So to begin with, we don't know much about Ayodhyadas's early life, except that he was born in Coimbatore, which you see here on the map, as Karthavarayan, and took the name of his teacher before moving to the Nilgiris region, where he practiced as a Siddha physician for several decades. Although Das was a Dalit himself, it was through his encounter with Dalit communities during this time that he first became politically active in the 1870s, arguing that Dalits were in fact Adi Dravidas, or original inhabitants of the land, and ought to be counted as non-Hindus in the census. These early preoccupations with the religious identity of Dalits with political representation became central to Das's career later on, although his turn to Buddhism was occasioned by a chance encounter with Henry Olcott. Now, many of us are familiar with Olcott as a prominent theosophist, as a founder of the Theosophical Society that is even today headquartered in Adyar in Madras. But he perhaps played a far more important role as an interlocutor for Buddhism in 19th century South and Southeast Asia. He was popularly known as the White Buddhist, and he traveled widely in the Eastern Indian Ocean world, to Ceylon, to Japan, and elsewhere, in his search for allies who would champion a Buddhist revival. On his travel to Ceylon, for example, he not only established the Buddhist Theosophical Society and several Buddhist schools, but also published a text called the Buddhist Catechism, which came to be recognized as an authoritative, if somewhat controversial, interpretation of Buddhist scripture. I actually found a news report about a court case in Ceylon in the early 1880s, where Olcott's catechism was cited as evidence by one of the lawyers in the case, and also accepted by the judge. More importantly, Olcott was also deeply interested in the idea of uniting Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, and launched what he called the United Buddhist World campaign to bring Southeast Asian and South Asian Buddhist revival efforts together. Olcott's call for this kind of pan-Asian Buddhist solidarity should be read in the context of broader developments. For instance, in Japan, the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, which precipitated the most violent suppression of Buddhism in Japanese history. In Ceylon, for example, the influence of Christian missionary activity and British overthrow of the last Kandyan king, all of which came together to provide a concrete foundation for an Asian Buddhist revival, which also shaped Ayuthi Das's own project in crucial ways. Which is to say, when Das turned to Buddhism in 1898, he was inevitably drawn into what scholars have theorized as a modern Buddhist world shaped by extensive interactions and interconnections across a wide variety of national, ethnic, cultural, and colonial boundaries. For instance, after Das established, along with several others, the Sakya Buddhist Society in Madras, in just a few years, the society grew in influence and established its presence in many parts of India and the British Empire through networks of labor migration in which Dalits were implicated. By 1911, you have branches of the society that were established near military bases in Nagpur, Sikandrabad, and Bangalore, mining camps in the Kolar goldfields, and labor camps in Burma and South Africa. Even more importantly, Das started the periodical Oru Paisa Tamilan in 1907, which is perhaps one of the few, if not the only, Tamil Dalit journals from the colonial period to have survived. Now, much of the existing scholarship on the 19th and 20th century Buddhist revival in India broadly has overlooked the global context which framed this revival. And as far as the Sakya Buddhist movement goes, this can be explained by the fact that the movement's relationship with the broader Buddhist world was somewhat circumspect. Their relationship with the Theosophical Society and the Mahabodhi Society, for example, quickly faded away, partly because Olcott was apparently not shown credible scriptural proof of the Tamil Dalits' Buddhist past, but also equally because, as we all know, the Theosophical Society itself took a conservative turn and became an upper caste Hindu stronghold, which meant that Olcott distanced himself from both the Sakya Buddhists and from Dharmapala. But the important point, I think, is that the Buddhist world of Asia and the West continued to be discussed in the pages of Tamilan long after the Sakya Buddhist movement's relationship with Olcott and Dharmapala ended. And I'm interested in the ways in which there were moments of remarkable intellectual and discursive synchronicities in the Sakya Buddhist imagination of the past and in the historical visions produced by the broader Asian Buddhist revival generally. So take, for instance, one of Das's most prominent writings, Indira Desa Charitaram, A History of Indra's Country, which was a serialized account of India's past that Das wrote between 1910 and 1911. What interests me in Das's writing is the keen sense of geography that pervades the narrative in this and other texts. When Das speaks of the world, he does so in terms of specific continents and realms, Kandam, Desam, Nadu, and the use of these precise spatial markers is striking because it, of course, speaks to a world in which it is natural to read nations and nationalisms back into the past. But the way it happens in Das's writing is interesting because it creates a world historical role for ancient India. And I'll come to that in just a minute. And it also serves to explain the distinct nature of India's impoverishment compared to the rest of the world. So the idea that India was not just the birthplace of Buddhism, from where the religion spread to other parts of the world, but also a site of important cultural and intellectual advancements was a common motif in the broader Buddhist revival of this period. in many ways, it became fertile ground for the convergence of different political commitments in the Asian Buddhist world. For instance, Anagarika Dharmapala, who represented Theravada Buddhism in the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, where as we all know, Swami Vivekananda made that famous speech in Chicago. And Dharmapala is even today, of course, a towering figure in Sri Lanka, persistently returned to the question of reviving Buddhism in India as a way of soliciting support for a Buddhist revival at home in Ceylon and abroad. And one of Dharmapala's cherished projects was the restoration of the Bodh Gaya temple to Buddhist possession, because it had come into Shaivite possession by the late 19th century, for which he founded the Mahabodhi Society and also established a journal that circulated widely within the Asian Buddhist world. Dharmapala also traveled widely in Asia himself to secure support for this project. So, for example, when he met the ruler of Siam, Thailand, for this purpose, he argued that reclaiming Bodh Gaya would be an unparalleled achievement for the king. And I've excerpted what he said here in the slide before you. So in writing after writing, not just those of Dharmapala, but also of Ayodhya Das and Ambedkar, both of whom published essays in the Mahabodhi journal regularly, India's ancient prosperity and contemporary decline became the central plot of the Buddhist revival. And this remained true even after Dharmapala lost the case he filed, which you see on your right in the slide here, to reclaim Bodh Gaya. So as late as 1916, for instance, you have politician and founder of Lanka's first political party, the Trotskyist Lanka Sama Samaja Party, who wrote in the Mahabodhi journal and argued that China received the light from India and Japan in turn from China. And I dwell on these instances where India became the focus of the Asian Buddhist revival to make the point that the narrative woven around and about India in this period not only recovered a world historical role for ancient India, but also set up a distinction between the colonized and the relatively independent parts of Asia, or the relatively modernized parts of Asia, I should say. In Das's own writings, this distinction became an important aspect of his critique of caste and informed his turn towards the broader Asian world. For instance, in an essay in 1909 called The Mockery of the Poor, Das argued that the intelligentsia and the elite pay no heed to the poor of this country, just as in other continents. But he concludes that the reason for this is unique in the Indian context. And you see the argument he made here in front of you. India's fall from grace, in Das's view, in other words, was because of caste. What is also interesting is that Das frequently returned to the motifs of labor and land and the alienation of Dalits from both as a way of distinguishing India's impoverishment from that of other Buddhist countries. Evidently, a country's ability to be the originator of intellectual or cultural advancements, as in ancient India's accomplishments in medicine, which we saw on an earlier slide, or to provide for the material well-being of all its people, as in the case of Buddhist countries in modern times, was an important index of the country's greatness in Das's structural logic. And in this way, the Buddhist world of the present of Asia is a mirror image to ancient India. So in suggesting that Dalits were enslaved descendants of ancient Buddhists, Das was not only able to claim an ancient and agentive past for Tamil Dalits, but also reorient them towards the broader Buddhist world, which, as we've seen, was for several reasons itself oriented towards a universalist agentive vision of Buddhism on the world stage. So in effect, by creating a world historical role for India and for Buddhism in the past, as well as by locating Tamil Dalits within a resurgent Buddhist world that was able to revel in pride, Das creates a Buddhist utopia that is a remembered past anchored in South India and India at large, and an existent present anchored in Asia and the West. So the Sakya Buddhist movement was profoundly shaped by the broader context of Buddhist revival in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which involved a remarkable degree of intellectual exchanges, political convergences, and travel between Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the West. Since the construction of a Buddhist tradition for Dalits was as much a religious endeavor as a political one, Dalit Buddhist movements like that of Ayodhya Das were inevitably enmeshed in the broader world of Buddhism within which they emerged. And so in this case, the Buddhist world of the Eastern Indian Ocean came alive as a modern iteration of India's ancient casteless Buddhist past, and produced for Tamil Dalits not just an emancipatory genealogy, but also an emancipatory geography within which to locate themselves. And if you see, I mean, I didn't have time to do this within the 15 minutes that I've been given, but part of this chapter in its original form in my master's thesis also deals a lot with the idea of imaginative geographies, and how this imagination of Asia in the Sakya Buddhist movement is very much an enchanted one, and very much one that lies outside of the conventional notions of time that disciplinary history usually takes recourse to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shrinidhi. And now I'll turn it over to Ganeshwar, please.
Good morning, I'm Ganeshwar. My paper is on Periyar's Spatial Thought, Region as Non-Brahmin Discursive Space. Existing scholarship on the Dravidian movement traditionally theorizes the self-respect years of the Dravidian movement, led by E.V. Ramasamy Periyar, as a primarily anti-caste movement, and the later part of the Dravidian movement, led by DMK, as a more spatially oriented and regionalist. This distinction is often emphasized to explain the de-radicalization of the Dravidian movement, even as historical studies of the conceptualization of region in Tamil Nadu invariably traces it back to the early Dravidian movement. Region is seen as peripheral to Periyar's more radical anti-caste thought. However, I contend that Periyar's spatial thought stems from his anti-caste thought and is key to understand his sharp critique of Indian nationalism. Instead of a physicalist view of space, this paper views nation and region as discursive spaces that determine the utterability and unutterability of discourses and constituted the vital barrier between rarity and materiality of discourses. This paper views Periyar's conceptualization of the region as a counter-discursive space which produced an ontological disruption in the narrative self-portrayal of the nation, aiding the ascendancy of an egalitarian non-Brahmin discourse into materiality. From his early days of political life, Periyar prioritized the politics of social change to the pursuit of power. This was Periyar's reason for joining the Madras Presidency Association, the non-Brahmin faction of the Indian National Congress, instead of joining the Justice Party, which he felt prioritized the pursuit of power for non-Brahmins to the harder work of reform of society. This deep suspicion of power politics made Gandhian constructive program attractive to Periyar in his early days. He championed Gandhian constructive program and non-cooperation movement in Tamil Nadu as he believed it can address the issue of untouchability, build a popular base, and an ideological credibility. This changed with the Kanchipuram Conference of Congress in 1925, which turned out to be the 6th conference where Congress leaders refused to even debate Periyar's resolution for proportional representation, despite Periyar's continued insistence that only proportional representation could ensure a citizenry of mutually trustful, self-respecting masses who can come together to form a nation. Added to this was Gandhi's repeated public support of Varnashrama Dharma and appreciation of Brahmins for preserving it during his successive visits to South India. Periyar left Congress and declared as his goal to end Congress and Gandhi hegemony in Tamil Nadu. These disagreements represented not a personal resentment, but a structural turn in Periyar's thought about caste and the nation. Periyar became convinced that the national movement not only lacked commitment towards the annihilation of caste, but considered it detrimental to their cause. The question for Periyar became why the national movement that polemized extensively about poverty was unable to address social inequality as manifested in caste, which for Periyar was the single greatest threat to national unity. The answer for Periyar could only be that the national movement did not see caste as a threat to Indian unity, but as its very basis. Periyar began to systematically think about how a nationalism that did not even notionally accept the principle of egalitarianism popularized itself. Periyar identified discursive trappings through which nationalism sustained itself and fended off egalitarian opposition to it. Periyar argued that Indian nationalism was unable to embrace fraternity, which was inconsistent with Brahminism, and therefore embraced an egoistic passion consistent with it. Elevating the cause of self-rule from political ideal to moral ideal, the national movement insisted on the urgency of constituting a nation as a moral imperative. Periyar consistently refuted moralizing this political end of nation because he considered that it made the nationalist oblivious to the barbarity and dehumanization that was ingrained in the national self. Bringing to forefront the politics of the ideal of self-respect, he pitted self-respect against self-rule and questioned the morality of the latter without the former. Periyar believed this facade of nationalist unity was but a cloak for its partisan interests. In his words, nationalism is communalism that does not announce itself gleefully. He argued that universal rhetoric of Congress leaders preserved the collective interest of those benefiting from the traditional social order by precluding any critique of it. Periyar's criticism of the sectarian nature of Gandhi and Congress was expressed most strongly during the Second Roundtable Conference and Pune Pact, where he resolutely took the side of Dr. Ambedkar and insisted on separate electorates for Adi Dravidas. Periyar argued that the fact that Gandhi would put his life at risk to prevent separate electorate for Adi Dravidas was proof of the fact that Gandhi and Congress were intent on wresting political control from the British, but were afraid of the power slipping to the Adi Dravidas, as it would undermine the basis of the desired Brahminical dominance in a future free polity. The moralized political ideal of self-rule, thus for Periyar, was nothing but Brahminical sectarianism masked in universal rhetoric. Going even further, Periyar argued that it was Gandhi who truly nationalized Brahminism. While Gandhi's nationalism was not anchored solely on perceived glory of the Hindu past like his predecessors, he anchored it on a new and in many ways original political ethic. But the supposedly new ethic preserved in itself the core of an older tyrannical ideology, that of Brahminism, and rendered it in the modern language of pure politics. This inflection of politics and religion rendered religion more immune to criticism and politics less conducive to reform. Periyar was convinced that it is imperative for new liberative politics to challenge and dislodge this old tyrannical social ideology. Thus, Periyar took upon himself the task not only of critiquing the old Brahminism, but exposing the old in the new nationalism, which for him was the most complete expression of political Brahminism. Lastly, Periyar believed that behind the facade of moral and spiritual integration, larger systemic changes in the realm of production was setting up a powerful Baniya class which carried a disproportionate indirect influence over national politics. He believed that the entire purpose of the nationalist movement was to ensure a seamless transfer of economic advantage for the Baniya classes in the pre-modern economy to the modern national economy. This, he criticized, was the actual purpose behind the spinning of the Khadi, not to help the ordinary masses, but the mill owners of Gujarat and Mumbai. Gandhian program of village reconstruction, according to Periyar, simply spatially rendered social hierarchy. By exploiting the labor from villages and not extending to them the surpluses and preserving the conditions of villages for moral spiritual reasons, Periyar argued that Brahmin non-Brahmin divide was recasted through the city-village divide. Periyar similarly criticized pushing Hindi education for the sake of unity, as he argued that the motive was not just unity, but a particular kind of unity desirable for the Baniya classes for a seamless homogeneous market that spoke their language. This also became the immediate cause for the explosion of the demand of sovereignty for Tamils. When Hindi was unilaterally imposed in schools of Madras Presidency, Periyar revolted against it as an attempt to infuse Brahminical values to school children, and this gave rise to the moment where he would most acutely direct his antipathy to the nationalist movement into a demand for Tamil sovereignty. Organizing a huge gathering with about 50,000 to 70,000 people along the beach of Madras, he would raise the slogan of Tamil Nadu for Tamils in an impassioned speech starkly different from his general calm tone of rationalist inquiry that declared that Tamil Nadu for Tamils should become an article of faith with the Tamils. Critiquing the Indian nationalism had in all functional realms instilled the logic of Brahminism to serve the Brahmin Baniya interests. He gradually but resolutely adopted a sovereign Tamil state as his political ideal, as he was convinced that the non-Brahmin sovereignty was inconceivable within a nation whose fragile unity was preserved through an anxious conformity with its Brahminical core. This project, he believed, was workable through a rationally conceived Tamil state. The quest for Tamil sovereignty for Periyar thus was in essence a quest for non-Brahmin sovereignty through which the non-Brahmin historic bloc was to undertake the task of creating a new social, economic, and ethical order. To construct such a non-Brahmin ethical order, he considered it necessary to sever the ties of Tamils with Sanskritic texts and practices and emerging national consciousness that sought to legitimize them. As a counter, Periyar emphasized the civilizational ethos of Dravidian past by a liberal reading of Tamil texts. Periyar heaped praise on the classical Tamil treatise of Tirukkural for exposing the differences between the Aryan and Tamil culture and prescribing egalitarianism as a remedy for Aryan ills. He also repeated that the concepts like Atma and Jati are alien to Tamils, as there is not even an equivalent to such terms in Tamil. Periyar also referenced ancient Sangam literature to argue that the concept of marriages and its rituals were never present among the ancient Tamils, as they only referred to romantic relationships between men and women, but never to irrevocable bond of marriage. But his political utopia of Dravida Nadu was certainly not a recreation of a hoary Tamil past as a solution to the degradation of Tamil lives. Indeed, he was highly critical of those who claimed so and ventured to de-fetishize the idea of Tamil region, sometimes even through harsh rhetoric. He challenged the supposedly great virtuosity of Tamil literature on two main grounds. Firstly, they lacked the rationalist scientific outlook that was needed to rethink our society and were too obsessed with religiosity. Secondly, there was nothing liberatory in Tamil literature for the Tamil woman to whom it only prescribed chastity and devotion. He criticized even the more secular Tamil texts that the Tamil nationalists claimed as representing the Dravidian civilizational values, like that of Silappatikaram and even parts of Tirukkural, for their regressive insistence of chastity and an inegalitarian domestic ethic. Thus, the distinctiveness of the Dravidian past was wielded by Periyar to delegitimize the virtue assumed of Brahminical religion and Indian nationalism. But the legitimacy of the Dravidian counter-imagination rested not in the glory of its hoary past, but in what he carefully crafted as the Dravidian ethic of self-respect and rationalism. In his own words, his receptiveness to and appreciation of Tamil was a rational choice. If I consider that my country will not help my ideals, I will not help to foster them. I will forthwith quit it. Similarly, if my language is not conducive to my ideals or the advancement of my people or to their living with self-respect, I will promptly discard it and follow what is useful. If I love Tamil, it is because I am aware of the advantage I expect through it and the measure of the loss that will occur through the absence of it. Distilling Brahminism as the ideological essence of the nation, he realized that the discursive space of nation formed the vital frontier between the rarity and materiality of non-Brahmin politics. The region for Periyar was the counter-discursive space that would enable the ascendancy of non-Brahmin politics from rarity to materiality. This is the political dimension of the regional consciousness that Periyar propagated that facilitated large-scale social changes in Tamil Nadu. Here, an interesting observation by Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek about the America of the 1960s and the America of the 1970s will be of interest. The spirit of permissiveness, sexual liberation, and counterculture that marked the 1960s in America, he observes, was even more pervasive in the 1970s. The difference, he says, is that in the 1960s, they were part of a utopian political protest movement, while in the 1970s, they were completely deprived of their political content and fully integrated into hegemonic culture and ideology. Žižek argues that it is important to recognize that it is the repression of the political dimension that facilitated this seamless integration into hegemonic culture. The assertion of Tamil identity through cultural distinctiveness, but unaccompanied by an egalitarian critique of dominant articulations of Indian nationalism, which Periyar critiqued as shielding a rigid and hierarchical social order, runs the same risk of seamless integration into hegemony. This paper aims to be a humble effort towards resuscitating the political dimension of the region and preserve its legacy from distortion, symbolization, and reductive culturalization in lieu of a more just society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganeshwar. And finally, we have Anish.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, Anish. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anish, and my paper titled, hello. My name is Anish, and my paper is titled Conceptions of Community, Nation and Politics, the Ezhavas of South Malabar and Their Quest of Equality. And this paper mainly discusses caste reforms, anti-caste ideas, and thoughts of nationalism amongst the Ezhavas of South Malabar in the South Madras Presidency. And taking cue from biographical accounts, archival sources, ethnography, fieldwork, I try to examine discursive equality, the right to the public, the process of community formation, ideology, and the mode of struggle for emancipation. And this paper progresses through the social history of Ezhavas, a numerically significant lower caste of Palakkad. I attempt to address the question of caste by what means the aspirations of lower castes were addressed in the uniting project of reformed Hinduism and nationalism. And this study demonstrates how complex ideas of process of modernity are expressed in and function in communities. In the coming session, I try to contextualize lower caste movement and engages with some of the dominant theses such as ethnicization and Sanskritization. And in Kerala, when it comes to Kerala, the Ezhavas are numerically large middle caste, and Srinarayana Dharma Paribalana Yogam, SNTP, their caste organization was founded in 1903. And this Yogam brought together Ezhavas. So according to Jeffrey, SNTP Yogam developed out of a unique nature of a local society and derived strength from the oppressive nature of local government. And it was a response to the increasing wealth and education of Ezhavas of Travancore. And Mohan articulates that middle class among the Ezhavas imbued with the ideals of individualism, humanism, democracy, and reason wanted to change the conservative obscurantist caste-ridden society. And Uday Kumar suggests that the Srinarayana movement primarily addressed the Ezhavas, appeal to the discard caste markers to internally reform into a samudayam or a community. As for Pulapalli, new elements, the arrival of a large number of Westerners in the 19th century stimulated the various social reform movements, including Ezhavas. Periyar argues that colonialism contributes to a restructuring of society to the creation of ethnic groups. And he further argues that Ezhavas forged a new identity by the end of colonial period. In the classification of Jaffa-Lot, Ezhava movements comes under the reform movements within the Hindu way of life. And despite many of these well-received works, the dichotomy of colonialism versus nationalism and the depiction of South Indian politics as sectarian competition for British patronage actually limits the potential for understanding localized movements and its vernacular expressions. In South Malabar, for instance, the influence of SNTP was limited, and the structure and agenda of the Ezhava movement here differs, and it shares more political similarities with the Madras. And in spite of this, some observers see social reform as a first step of a national movement and mark Narayana Guru's supporters as the pioneers of national movement in Kerala. If this claim is acknowledged, the national movement must be viewed as a single project of consensus without distinctions. Then we miss out on understanding disagreement, conflicts, consensus, and politics of many subnationalities within national when this happens. Thus, the present study of South Malabar does not fit into these typologies of lower caste movements, nor is it adapted to a general view of caste associations. When we look at the Ezhavas as a caste, Ezhavas form a backward Hindu caste in Kerala. If you go by the conventional classification, the Ezhavas comes under the untouchable or polluting Varna caste. However, they constitute highest among the excluded castes, and hence their position would be in the middle of the caste hierarchy. Their primary occupation was the planting of palm trees and the production of toddy, coconut fiber, and jaggery. And they were also seen engaged in other types of occupations. And another version of interpretation is that they are foreigners who came from Ceylon. And when it comes to the social position of Ezhavas, South Malabar Ezhavas, they lag behind in terms of education, employment, representation. Also, their presence in the public sphere was very, very limited. And despite these, the Ezhavas made most of the socioeconomic reforms spearheaded by the British. Given the modest improvements in socioeconomic education attainment, the caste discrimination did not disappear drastically, and this was contrary to their achievements. The lack of adequate representation in government has sparked widespread discontent, and the Ezhava leaders have elevated the issue to a critical political agenda. However, with the spread of print culture and Ezhava public sphere formed here, while restricted in scope, these utterances were enough to dissect Savarna hegemony. These vernacular publishing efforts have succeeded in raising political consciousness of the community. In the next session, I described about the colonial encounters of Ezhavas. Colonial project often seen as a civilizing mission, control and command, modernizing our knowledge gathering. Yet, As Pandyan suggests, colonialism also provided the ground for articulating new forms of identities. While many colonial subjects regarded colonial rule as oppressive and subjugating, Ezhavas had a very different view of colonialism. Chami, an intellectual from Palakkad, comprehends this perspective. He says that the coming of Westerners is a primary reason of modern civilization and growth of Ezhavas. Then the subjective experience of South Malabar Ezhavas does not provide any hint of oppressive nature of colonialism in an absolute sense. They indeed had to face a marginalization under colonialism, but then this marginality came up explicitly from the particular socio-economic political situation of Madras, a condition where opportunities, especially education and job, denied. This happens precisely because in the beginning of the 20th century, Brahmins maintained their monopoly in civil administration. This domination of Brahmins in public life have hampered prospect of numerous non-Brahmin castes and depressed classes. The achievement of other communities were negligible compared to the Brahmins. Perhaps for this reason, as stated earlier, Ezhava marginality was mainly conditioned by underrepresentation in the government, lack of education opportunities, less chances for occupational mobility, right to the public. Instead of engaging in confrontation, they sought to resolve issues through petitions and memorials. While being critical of the government policies and unholy alliance between Brahmins and the government, these communities regularly sought to resolve their grievances within the purview of state power. As early as 1900s, the Ezhava was organized as like any other communities in the colonial India. It was also organized meetings, formed sabhas and meetings that pursued for more substantive community improvements. Then they formed sabhas to improve, to address community issues, forming organizational structure and to reform caste practices. And these meetings served as a venue for unified political declarations. At one such meeting held at Yakara temple premises, the participants held the view that Ezhavas shall seek ways for progress and well-being under the British government. Because of resentment over non-Brahmin leadership in national movement and Home Rule League, they decided not to support Home Rule movement in any form. And this is also a time when new types of subjectivities have risen as the Madras presidency underwent significant radical political reforms. Along with the International Congress Home Rule League, another critical political mobilization occurred with the arrival of non-Brahmin movement and the awakening of Adi Dravidas. The Ezhava movement, despite its local intent, went further, succeeding in building linkages with the growing provincial politics. At the beginning of the 1920s, national movement began to grow strong. Gandhi emerged as a undisputed leader of the movement. With the insistence of Gandhi, the Congress launched the non-cooperation movement in 1920 over the wrongs of Punjab and Khilafat. And the Ezhavas were outraged that the Congress was inciting hatred against the government among people through speeches and meetings across the country. And they were forced to take a skeptical view against the Gandhi's call for boycott of schools, courts, and government institutions by voicing their strong opposition. So in response to these, the non-cooperation movement, they launched a wave of anti-non-cooperation protest rallies in Palakkad beginning from June 1921. From July 1921 to March 1922, Ezhava workers instituted around 14 yogams in various ashrams localities in Palakkad. So the dissenting Ezhavas have effectively used the anti-non-cooperation stand to turn their community into an acquiescent political community, active recipient of imperial government policies. And the depressed class representative constantly put pressure on especially after the coming of the introduction of a diarchy constitution, constantly put pressure on the government to establish their right to access public places. And Madras government, in response to the demands, passed an order on 25th August 1924 concerning the entry of depressed classes in public roads, wells, and other freedoms to travel freely along the public road or street in town or village throughout the presidency. The copies of the order were printed and distributed along with a statement urging the Ezhavas to make use of the freedom to enter public street during Kalpati car festival. And this Kalpati is a Brahmin Agraharam street, which is exclusively appropriated to the use of the Brahmins. After all, even the middle classes such as Ezhavas were not allowed to enter in these villages or streets. And this Kalpati entry was led by a Ezhava leader, MP Raghavan, who informed the official about the intention in advance, and the official also told the Ezhavas that there would be no resistance to going to the festival. And officers ensured that Ezhavas should be allowed to a place so that they can see the festival and return. Around, according to the directions of the authorities, around 80 Ezhavas reached the venue of the festival on 30th November 1924 in accordance with the order of the government and the guidance from the collector. They observed the festival in 3 groups. As the Ezhavas returned, they were blocked by the Brahmins and assaulted with sticks and stones. And the government, subsequently, the government banned the Ezhavas under the section of 144 of the Penal Code, and the Brahmins were allowed to hold the festival after completing necessary purification and rituals. And this incident shows the differential treatment meted out by the state on its citizens and perpetual violation of rights of depressed classes and lower castes. This incident also prompted questions in Madras Legislative Council. In responding to questions, C.P. Ramasamy, the member in charge, replied that the rights pertain to a particular road. It had to be established by regular judicial proceedings. The issue here is that if the government wanted to ensure that all subjects have equal access to public spaces, why would it suggest that the right be established through litigation? Despite multiple complaints and requests, the government did not take any steps in favor of the Avarnas, which in turn gave legitimacy to the Savarna violence. And several presidency districts were reported to have witnessed similar kind of uprising of depressed classes. But it is worth noting that none of these struggles received significant support from Gandhi or the Congress, the major political force at the time. The Kalpati incident triggered intense debate among the Ezhavas on religious conversion. The Mappila revolt and the struggle in Kalpati have created a fear of religious conversion all over India, resulting South Malabar attracted the attention of Hindu reform leaders, religious communal organizations, particularly the Shuddhi Sangadan movements. The Arya Samaj took advantage of the situation in Kalpati. Hurriedly, their activists began to work. Gradually, Ezhavas started joining Arya Samaj as a last resort to escape from untouchability. The Ezhavas, wearing the holy thread, entered Kalpati as they desired through this method. However, the activities of Arya Samaj in Kerala had created a furor, and they faced opposition from the Orthodox Hindus. Finally, Arya Samaj had obtained a ruling from the High Court of Madras that all members of the public have equal rights in the public streets, and that one segment of society cannot exclude another section from using the public roads. So in the next coming session, I consider the aftermath of Kalpati struggles. After the Kalpati struggle, around 100 was Christianity, Arya Samajam, and Islam, and infringing on Hindu social order and Brahmin hegemony. At the end of the two-year-long struggle, the robust stance of the Brahmins miserably failed. Many Ezhavas gained freedom to enter Kalpati Agraharam street. The Ezhavas who had been converted to Christianity for entry into the Kalpati street returned to the community. Just a few of them remained within the Christianity and Arya Samaj. In theory, Ezhavas' attempt was not to discover a new type of piety, a worldview, or to live according to a distinct religion, or to embrace a new religion. The main aim of the religious conversion was to achieve liberation from caste harassment, and this was the primary purpose of the entire debate of conversion. And those who had shown interest in converting were kept within the Hindu fold, within the help of Arya Samaj, Brahma Sabha, Theosophy, Hindu Mahasabha, and they brought back the converts. However, the quest for liberation could not stop Ezhavas from continuing with this debate of conversions, and they called conversion sabhas in various localities, and the committees were formed for campaigning in favor of the religious conversion. And finally, the pastors of the Marthoma Church from Travancore came to Palakkad and baptized Ezhavas. In between 1926 to 1932, about 52 individuals took baptism and became Christians under Marthoma Church. In addition, people have also been converted to Islam on numerous occasions since 1926. And there existed a strong belief among the Ezhavas that they were originally Sinhalese from Ceylon, and many Ezhava intellectuals had already embraced Buddhism in other princely states of Travancore and Kochi. The Buddhist mission was operational in few amsams with Palakkad, and 6 Buddhist groups visited Malabar in between 1918 and 1935. And in a huge meeting held in 1924, around 50 individuals took 5 vows, and later the Palakkad Buddhist mission formed by joining small units. As we have seen, the primary intention of the religious conversion was to liberate themselves from caste oppression. Contrastly, a minority of the converts remained devout religionists throughout their lives. However, in the post-conversion phase, a situation emerged in which Ezhavas seemed to have lost their direction. Looking for answers to their spiritual and political questions, Gandhi's guidance was finally sought. When during Kerala visit, Gandhi received a delegation of Ezhava leaders on October 1927. The Ezhavas wanted to know from Gandhi whether their other religions could be accepted to seek relief for their problems. Gandhi said that they must not renounce the Hindu faith; they must fight the cause with their might. Gandhi had no opposition to the joining of Ezhavas to Arya Samaj or Brahma Samaj. And the Ezhava leader Gopalan argued that redemption of his group lies either in conversion to other faiths or in non-participation in the fight for Swaraj. However, the Ezhavas wanted to know whether purified Hinduism would be possible. And Gandhi's response to this question was yes. And he said that he wasn't going to be Hindu and he could not survive. And this Gandhian stance on caste had far-reaching implications for anti-caste struggles of untouchable castes in India. The cost were potential of spiritual salvation, moral upliftment, non-Hindu self by conversion was effectively trampled on by Shuddhi, Sangadan, and Gandhian social reform. Reform Hinduism and the overarching force of nationalism conquered dissenting nationalities, crushing all other castes, all lower caste resistances. And I'm moving to the concluding part. And there is a large body of literature about the reform movements of Ezhavas. For instance, Osella and Osella argued that modernity, together with a generalized commitment to progress, appears as integral to Ezhavas' self-defined identities, embedded in community identity that was forged through a long process of reforms and mobilization. And this paper also depicts the long process of mobilization and reforms aimed at fostering a sense of a community or samudayam rather than building ethnic identities. And lower castes try to restructure the broader public sphere by articulating the fundamentals of anti-caste ideology, the imaginations of nation, community, and sociality. And the existing framework of knowledge, ideology, performative aspects linked to caste has been challenged. The alleged dominance of Brahmins has been questioned by prudently constructed counter narratives, and they aimed at construction of an alternative public and public opinion through publishing and history writing. While the Hindu reform movement sought to create a unified Hindu identity, the Ezhava campaign was ultimately opposed to the establishment of a homogeneous Hindu community. And it is argued that lower caste politics in Kerala differs significantly in ideology and political orientation and had not followed a single trajectory. As Jeffrey notes, this awakenings appears to have inherently linked with the existential conditions and specific location of the castes in the hierarchy. Thus, these instances are uneven and many-sided. I contend that Ezhava's association simply the presence of the presence of an autonomous anti-caste movement in the South Malabar region. The anti-caste movement necessitates critical analysis, so because politics it articulated is as important as the anti-caste ideology. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you. It's rare that all papers within a thematic session fit together. But in this case, not only do the papers fit really nicely together, but they are all complementary to one another. It's as if the authors conspired together to write a book on this theme, and you just heard one of the drafts of the book. So all the papers were set in the late 1800s, early 1900s in colonial southern India, and all consider the anti-caste spatial politics inscribed in Tamil Buddhist, Dravidian, and Ezhava thought, respectively, forged in opposition to what G. Aloysius famously calls Brahminic nationalism. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to speak across the three papers, and I'm going to focus on the two central analytics of this session, namely space and nation. And I'm going to pose some questions to the speakers along these two analytics, and also ask them to reflect on the contemporary relevance of their arguments. So first, all papers focus on spatial strategy as a mode of resistance to caste oppression and Brahminic nationalism. So what do I mean by spatial strategy? Ganeshwar's paper provides a clear definition, drawing on the thinking of Henri Lefebvre. Space is not a passive container. Space is not just an inert backdrop. Rather, space is a social product, space is a discursive product. Space is a political product. This is what Lefebvre referred to as the production of space. Srinidhi's paper uses a related concept drawing on literary studies of Tamil literature, namely spatial fabulation. To fabulate in literature means to fuse the real and the imagined, the everyday and the mythical. Spatial fabulation, borrowing from Sumati Ramasamy, that Srinidhi quotes in her paper, is, quote, the process of thinking imaginatively and enchantingly about places not actually present or existing, end quote. In Srinidhi's paper, the first one you heard, she shows how in the context of the late 19th century Madras presidency, Pandit Ayodhi Das's casteless Tamil Buddhism set forth an inventive spatial geography of Buddhist internationalism, one opposed to Brahminic nationalism. A Tamil Dalit who was deeply knowledgeable about traditional Siddha medicine and classical Tamil literature, Das, himself a converted to Buddhism, sought to recast Tamil Periyars, ex-untouchable toilers exploited by Brahmin mirazadars and colonial revenue collectors alike, as Adi Dravidas, meaning the original inhabitants of the land. Now, to do this, it was imperative for Das to reconstruct them as descendants of casteless Tamil Buddhists. And to do this, Das engaged in what Gajendran Ayadare calls, quote, a multilinear retracing of a casteless past, end quote. What is so fascinating about Srinidhi's work is her close reading of the periodical Tamiran. The pages of Tamiran were filled with spatial fabulations, flights of imagination, as MSS Pandian has called it, but that were very much rooted in actually existing material and spatial conditions of the Parayars. Das reconstructed India's past as an egalitarian Buddhist past that was destroyed by Brahmins who used their cunning and greed to shackle Parayars. Crucially, Srinidhi finds that Das used the pages of Tamiran to forge a pan-Asian Buddhist solidarity. This was done through what she refers to as spatial and temporal mirroring. For instance, Das sought to show that contemporary Japan, Burma, and Ceylon looked like a precast, ancient, and enchanted Buddhist India. Just as Das imagined a casteless Buddhist past and an internationalized pan-Asian Buddhist present, Periyar also engaged in spatial strategy. For Tante Periyar, the Tamil region assumes utmost importance. That was his spatial strategy. Thus, the central argument of Ganeshwar's paper is that Periyar produces Tamil regionalism in opposition to Brahmanic nationalism. Key is how Periyar's self-respect movement gets positioned as a regional consciousness movement. The Tamil-speaking, self-respecting individual, part of a non-Brahmin public, and the Dravidian geographical region become collapsed as one spatial assemblage, one spatial fabulation, if you like, the Tamil Nadu or the Tamil country. And this is to oppose Congress nationalism or Brahmanic nationalism. Finally, in Anish's paper, we also see the deployment of a creative spatial strategy, this time among the Ezhavas of colonial Malabar. Here, it is the Ezhava Samudayam, the everyday local space of the Ezhava community that matter. Anish shows how the Ezhavas claimed access to everyday spaces such as public roads, public squares, temples, and water tanks, contemporaneous with Baba Saheb Ambedkar's claim on the Mahad water tank. So that's also a really interesting historical contemporaneous struggle. The Kalpati struggle, as I said, contemporaneous with the Mahad struggle, was one such localized spatial struggle in which the Ezhavas invoked British colonial law's definition of public to resist Brahmin usurpation of public roads. So I found this engagement with spatial strategy, spatial fabulation, spatial production, just brilliant and very, very thought-provoking across all three papers. So I would like to invite the authors to think not simply about spatial strategy, but also about scalar strategy, okay? So critical geographers use the term rescaling to refer to an imaginative process by which the taken for granted hegemonic nature of nested scales. For instance, our mental model is such that the local is nested within the regional, nested within the national, nested within the international, right? But rescaling means a disruption, a turning upside down of that taken for granted scalar model. Each of the Dalit Bahujan leaders studied, Ayoti Das, Tante Periyar, and Sri Narayana Guru, the latter being the Yerava leader of Kerala, engaged in this creative rescaling in order to resist the scale of Brahmanic nationalism. And they also use print media to foster anti-caste publics that transcend scale. And this is also an important part of the scalar strategy. So I have a question for Shrinidhi and then one for Anish on spatial and scalar strategy here. So Srinidhi, you mentioned in passing that branches of the Sakya Buddhist Society were established in the labor camps of the Kola gold fields in Karnataka, as well as those of Burma and South Africa, to which Tamils migrated or were forcibly brought as indentured laborers. The pages of Tamiran probably also reached those places, as Ayadure has been discussing. So my question is, how might the internationalism, the internationalization of Tamil Buddhism, something that I feel few scholars appreciate, how might that enrich our understanding of Dalit internationalism today? Relatedly, while I was reading your paper, Srinidhi, I kept having at the back of my mind Dr. Ambedkar's theorizing that the contempt for Buddhists lay at the root of untouchability. But Ambedkar doesn't mention Ayoti Das to the best of my knowledge. So why does it seem that Ambedkarite Buddhism and Tamil Buddhism have trodden quite separate intellectual histories? For Anish, I wanted to hear a bit more about how the Yeravas claimed access to public space on legal grounds. So you mentioned that legal arguments were not always successful, since Brahmin judges, lawyers, administrators often ruled in favor of Brahmins against public access. No surprises there. So under what conditions were Yerava spatial strategies successful? Okay, now turning to the second theme that runs across all three papers is, of course, a trenchant critique of Brahmanic nationalism. Ganeshwar's tracing of Periyar's intellectual evolution, from Periyar's initial openness to engaging with Gandhi, to its frustration and rejection of Gandhi's conservatism on caste, especially after the Pune Pact, is very instructive here. Periyar quipped that Gandhi had only two friends, the North Indian Baniya and the South Indian Brahmin. So a question for Ganeshwar. One sentence that really stood out to me in your paper was the following, quote, "For Periyar, the word nationalism had become a tool through which leaders could ignore the cause of upliftment of their people and keep them forever as backward classes," end quote. This quote stood out to me because it basically encapsulates the arguments of all three papers. But also it continues to be salient today. Had he been alive, Periyar would have been deeply critical of Hindutva politics and how the state uses the label anti-national to demonize Dalit Bahujan, Adivasi, and Muslim groups and to suppress their human rights. To quote Chinnaya Jangam, who writes on Andhra Dalit politics, quote, "Historical reading and the study of the writings and activities of Dalits demonstrates that the contemporary trajectory is a continuation of the caste Hindu Brahmanical imagination embedded in the idea of nation," end quote. So my question to you, Ganeshwar, is what are the contemporary legacies of Periyar regionalism, both for Tamil Nadu, where there seems to be a divergence between conservative Tamil nationalism on the one hand and Dravidian regional consciousness on the other, as Vignesh Rajamani and Karthick Ram Manoharan have written? And what is the relevance for India as a whole? So I also have a question for Anish on the subject of nationalism. As compared to Tamil Buddhists and Periyarists, would you agree that Yeravas had a more ambivalent relationship with nationalism? On the one hand, Yeravas were highly suspicious of the nationalists who ignored the cause of Dalit emancipation. Yeravas viewed the British favorably because colonialism enabled representation and education for the depressed classes. Yet, isn't it also true that some of the Yeravas were nevertheless co-opted by the Arya Samaj and by Gandhi into supporting the nationalist cause? In the final analysis, what I read from your paper, Anish, is that the Yerava story is heterogeneous and is complex. It involves some revolutionary conversions out of Hinduism, but also reformism within Hinduism. For instance, temple entry became a major cause. So what does your nuanced historical reading of Yerava politics tell us more broadly about the relationship between Dalit politics and nationalism today? And perhaps here you'd also like to comment on the relationship between Dalit politics, discourses on conversion, and nationalism. In conclusion, it is my sincere belief that these papers are a rich contribution to what Gajendran calls critical caste studies, in that they study Dalit spatial thought and nationalism in the late colonial period in a region, namely Southern India, on which much more such analysis is needed. I'll end with a quote from Anish's paper. We need to make visible these anti-caste struggles, for if we don't, quote, we miss out on understanding disagreements, conflicts, consensus, and the spatial politics of many sub-nationalities within the national, end quote. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Okay, so we've already received some questions, and you might want to think also about the contemporary relevance question that I asked you. So let's see. So we can start with a question for Srinidhi. So considering Das's rejection of discriminating and degrading categories such as Shudra, Periyar, depressed classes, untouchables, so on, and his upholding of casteless Tamil and Tamil Buddhism identities, how does the category Dalit help to view caste-based oppressed communities? Perhaps Das might have rejected the term Dalit or Tamil Dalit, since it would re-ghettoize and freeze the pre-caste, casteless, and anti-caste vernacular communities as broken. So if you would please comment on the label Dalit and what you think Das might have thought about this label.
Hi, thank you for the question. I feel slightly embarrassed answering this because I feel like Gajendran Nair, I should just take all my questions for this paper. But as far as I know, Das himself never used the term Dalit, which was of course not. He passed away in the early decades of the 20th century, in the second decade, and so. This was not a term that was part of the political currency then. The term he preferred was Adi Dravida, which to him was a way of re-signaling and establishing the Dalit person's relationship with land and the primacy of that relationship and that belonging that it suggested over other kinds of ascribed notions of subordination, that are written onto the Dalit person. And so Dalit is very much a term that I use in the paper because it has now become part of the political currency of the Tamil public sphere. And so I feel like it is very much appropriate to use that word. And I do not use the word Periyar, or if I do, in my thesis, for example, I make sure to write that I am not when I write in my own voice, I don't use the word Periyar. I only use the word Periyar if it appears in the historical record, because as we all know, it is very much like any other, any other racial slur, and so Periyar is a term that he rejected. It is a name that people reject even today. Dalit was a term that did not exist or was not in vogue when Ayodhya Das was writing, so it didn't form part of his own writings. And Adi Dravida was very much the term that he preferred, because for him it was central to his reimagining of the Dalits belonging in to the land, to India, and to South India.
Thank you. So here's a question for Ganeshwar. And then I'll ask one to Anish after Ganeshwar answers. And while we're waiting for more questions, maybe I'll ask each of you to reflect on the kind of contemporary relevance of your work. So this question is for Ganeshwar. What's the position, or what was perhaps the position of Periyar on Gandhi after the latter's assassination? Was Periyar's hard stance against Gandhi radically changed after the revelation of RSS involvement in the murder of Gandhi?
Thank you, Professor. Firstly, answering the question that you were asking earlier, as far as the difference between, like today there are diverging trends of conservative Tamil nationalism, which verge on ethnic nationalism and even some on ethnic fascism, while the talk is very much on ostracizing certain communities that are not considered Tamil and so on and so forth, expounded by certain sections of Tamil nationalists. And of course, Periyar was very critical of this, and he defined a Dravidian not through racial or linguistic or not even through caste terms. And his definition of the Dravidian was the person who accepted the ethic of egalitarianism, that everyone was born equal, the ethic of Tirukkural, Pirapokkum Ella Uyarkum, and anyone who would accept that ethic and incorporate in his personal life, for him was a Dravidian. And the difference between such a nationalism and this ethnic nationalism is for everyone to see. And as far as the contemporary Dravidian regionalist idea is concerned, it has, of course, incorporated within itself some elements of Periyar's radical thought, but not it entirely. For example, one of the biggest casualties of the DMK's recasting of regionalism, of the conception of regional identity would be gender, where it has DMK has pretty much prioritized a more masculine, culturalized idea of Tamil pride and honor, as opposed to the insistence of self-respect by Periyar. And that is why I wanted to, I added in the last that Periyar's nationalism, Periyar's articulation of the Tamil region did not pit region against region, but it pitted the nation that was anxious of social reform to the region that was fertile for it. And therefore, for Periyar, that was the primary consideration of which is the spatial category that would most readily accept change towards a more egalitarian and just society. As far as this question on Gandhi is concerned, of course, after Gandhi's assassination, immediately Periyar was very moved, and he called Gandhi as the first casualty of Brahmin terrorism in independent India, and he even called that India should be renamed as Gandhi Nadu or Gandhi country at that juncture. But later on, he would qualify his position and say that Gandhi became the victim to the poison of Brahminism, something that he himself willfully allowed to spread in the nation. And therefore, structurally speaking, his position on Congress or the nationalist movement did not change with his assassination. Of course, but from the very inception of RSS, Periyar was very critical of RSS, and he said that it is imperative that we don't let RSS set its foothold in Tamil Nadu, and rejected it vociferously. But that did not result in him de facto accepting Congress nationalism as the more acceptable form of nationalism. He did remain critical of it towards till the end of his life. When in 1972 he would reinitiate his struggle for Dravida Nadu.
Thank you, Ganeshwar. That was a very comprehensive answer. Can I invite Srinidhi and Anish to please turn your cameras on and leave them on so we can have a conversation? Thank you. Srinidhi, I'll return to you about the contemporary relevance for Dalit internationalism, because I'm sure people really want to hear something about that. But let me turn to Anish now. Anish, the question here is, can you state any attempt by the Ezhavas to create an alternative caste-free religious discourse that was distinct from the social reform efforts of Sri Narayan Guru's SNDP? So were there any other strains of creating a caste-free Hinduism that were different?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Malini for the question. And we could see that, because ever since the formation of the movement, which began from the early 1900s onwards. For instance, leaders like Palpu, Dr. Palpu was the instrumental in creating the SNDP movement, and he sought to he attempted to write the history of Ezhavas. He himself believed that Ezhavas are Buddhists who came from Ceylon. And he also offered a prize he also attempted to invited transcript from different scholars, and he prompted others to write their own community histories. And many of the scholars they wrote, but he found that it was not worth publishing, so he did not venture into the publishing the idea of publishing it. But the belief was that the main debate was that Ezhavas are Buddhists from Sri Lanka. And here also I see that in Palakkad, in the context of Palakkad also, one Ezhava intellectual, namely Chami, Ilabandan Chami, he also wrote a book called Ezhava Charitram. He published he wrote it as a handwritten manuscript, but it published recently by some rationalists, and they published it recently also. But he argues that he also argues that in that book, the Ezhava Charitram, he argues that Ezhavas are without any doubt, he claims that in Ezhavas are Buddhists, and he contrasts between Ezhavas of Malabar and Sinhalas of Sri Lanka, and using socio-cultural similarities between the people of Ezhavas of Malabar and the Sinhalas of Travancore. And he claims that after the coming of the Brahmanism to the coast, and the Ezhavas have lost their prominence, and they came under the oppression of oppressive systems of oppression of the Brahmins, and they forgotten their ancient religion, and they given up the Buddhist traditions and beliefs. And that was his argument. And in Travancore also we could see similar kind of arguments. And one of the activists, scholars, his name is E. Madhavan. He also claims that he wrote a book called Swadandra Samudaya, that means independent community. And he claims that Ezhavas are neither Hindus nor Buddhists; they are an independent community. And that was the kind of debate was going on, during these early 1930s and 60s. But what happens after that? By the end of even the mid of 1930s, the Congress which lost ground in Malabar, and they came back after with the civil disobedience movement, and the prominence, and the Gandhi also gained prominence among the group which earlier shown non-cooperation attitude towards the Congress. They also started to coming to the fall of the Congress. And in these in different ways, in these especially the anti-caste ideologies propagated by the as you said, it was overtaken by the by the Congress nationalism, and the discourses around it. So that is what happened. And the questions on the about the spatiality. So actually, my thesis is on caste, and I'm working on a thesis on caste and social space, and I'm a student of development studies. And initially, I thought that I would use the space, the social space concept, the concept of social space, as said by Periyar Bourdieu. Then after going to the field, a few things came up, and I did a two-year-long ethnographic field work, and a few things came up, and I had to reconsider the theoretical frameworks, and which I thought to be implemented in my research. So I have not yet thought of something like as you said the spatial the what the geographers do. So there also I will have to reconsider the concept which I have used in a social space in the sense used by here I consider social space as synonymous as society. So and in the contemporary times I have I would love to think about the about in terms of social space and spatiality.
Okay,
So the yeah.
Do you have a final thought, Anish, please?
Yeah, yes. No, ma'am.
Okay. Then I'll turn it over to Shrinidhi and invite you to perhaps reflect on the two questions that I posed.
Hi, thank you. So the first question that you kind of asked me on the possibilities and lessons that Dalit internationalism can offer us, I think there's two very interesting possibilities that for me emerge from what the Sakya Buddhist movement does in the early 20th century. And the first is we must remember that that Ayodhyadas passed away in 1914. So this is even before the Bolshevik Revolution, and he speaks of, and with Dalits migrating because as laborers to these kind of faraway places that are part of the British Empire. And when he speaks so much about Dalits' labor, about land, and about their alienation from both, it's interesting because to me there is a very early idea here of some kind of these ideas of internationalism and of an international working class that to us seem very obvious, that seem to come from a later kind of Bolshevik Marxist tradition, are actually, you see a lot of that emerging much earlier on in Ayodhyadas's work, which to me is very interesting to think about what it means to have this kind of an international diaspora of that is a working class and experience not just caste discrimination, but also, of course, abject poverty and all that comes with being the working class in a foreign land. And secondly, and relatedly, there is, of course, always this conversation and dialogue about how much we can speak of caste and race as similar experiences, ideas, etc. And to me, this is interesting because it offers us a way of thinking about race and caste in that doesn't simplify both. So when you have this Dalit working class that is spread out from India to other parts of the world, it draws attention to the fact that to put it simply, all diasporas and all migrations are not equal. Some are more equal than others, so to say. And so it's not, we shouldn't kind of, it basically breaks the primacy of race as a category for thinking about the diaspora, because the Dalit experience is so particular. The Dalit laborers who kind of go out, who are, I should say, not go out, who are taken out of the country and are pushed out of the country into plantations or like labor camps or elsewhere, their experience of migration, of being part of the diaspora, is just so vastly different from generally how we tend to think of diaspora and migration, that I think it's a very useful way of breaking simplistic connections between race and caste. So I think in those two ways, an international Marxism and thinking about race and caste, but not in these simplified ways. For those two reasons, I think this kind of Dalit internationalism is interesting. And as to the question of why there isn't that much of a dialogue between the Ambedkarite turn to Buddhism and the Tamil one, it's funny because that's actually what I started out wanting to study for my thesis. I wanted to study connections between the Ambedkarite movement and the Periyarite movement. And what I found was, unfortunately, that there is, especially in Kodi Arasa and in other kind of non-Brahmin and Dravidian journals, there is very much, you do see a lot of referencing to developments that are happening in Bombay, in the Bombay presidency, and to Ambedkar. But the reverse is actually not true. I don't, at least in my, whatever I read, I didn't find an equal. So it was odd because it was kind of like a one-way dialogue. Just to give you an example, after Ambedkar gets disinvited by the Jat Pak Todak Mandal and he decides to publish Annihilation of Caste on his own, Periyar is actually one of the first to kind of get a translation done in Kodi Arasa. But the reverse is not true. so many of Periyar's seminal texts are never, for example, translated contemporaneously into Marathi or into English. These translations might exist today, but certainly this didn't happen while Periyar was alive in his own lifetime. So there is, so I don't know what the explanation is. Perhaps it has something to do with language, just the sheer fact that not just Periyar, but also everybody in this Tamil public sphere is very much working within and through Tamil history and historical and literary categories that are not being translated. Perhaps it just has something to do with that, but I haven't been able to find a very convincing explanation for this. And this is also why I abandoned that initial thesis project and turned my attention only to the Tamil anti-caste movement.
Thank you, Shrinidhi. Very, very, very interesting answers. Both what you just said now, that you tried to look for some cross-fertilization between the Ambedkarite and Tamil Buddhist literatures, but were not able to find a kind of two-way flow. And your commentary about how forced Tamil labor migration really nuances how we think about international discussions on race and caste and sort of global dimensions of racialization. Extremely interesting. So Ganeshwar, we have a very provocative question for you. That is, do you think that the category Dravidian seems to be redundant given Periyar's realization of this, the significance of vernacular Tamil and Tamil identity politics? I mean, I think the question is basically, asking you, to what extent is this label Dravidian useful anymore?
I think it is. Of course, any identity which is conceptualized is susceptible to being appropriated and used for a particular narrower means. But that doesn't mean that the potential, the usage of Dravidian was was a specific choice that Periyar made, and he continued, because for Periyar, he wanted to forge a broad unity, where he wanted, because the particular feature of caste as a system of discrimination is that it is a system of graded inequality, where almost every particular caste feels as if it is benefiting from this system because there are castes lower than them from which it can benefit through the system. But Periyar wanted to establish the fact that all castes, almost all castes, are victims of the system of hierarchicalization called caste, and therefore there is a scope for a broader unity as oppressed masses. And this doesn't mean that he thought that the vast number of castes can be simply forged into two opposing blocks. He was aware of the differences within these castes and always spoke to particular caste associations and repeatedly tried to negotiate these differences. But he still thought that for the materiality of anti-caste struggle, a broader unity as the oppressed and non-essentialized identity was very important for carrying forward this. And I think throughout Tamil history, even before Periyar, even if you look at Ayodhyadas' Parpanar Parayar distinction, he used Parayar not as a particular caste identity, but as a more general term, which at least in the reading of Aloysius, included all oppressed castes. Even in Saivite reading of Dravidian history, it might have prioritized or favored a particular caste of non-Brahmins, but then it symbolized it painted the vast majority of the Tamil population as victims of caste, and therefore I think it still holds value, because a vast majority of the population does continue to be affected by this system of caste, and therefore I think we have to stick with the more radical traditions and not dissemble the identity totally at all. I think that wouldn't be a wise thing to do.
Thank you so much. So we only have 6 minutes left, actually, and I'd like to split the time between Shrinidhi and Anish, give maybe very brief answers. So for Anish first, if you could give a brief answer, what does this history on the Ezhavas tell us about kind of contemporary discussions on religious conversions? You have from the right wing these derogatory discourses around the rice bag converts, but we see in your research that in fact converting or adopting Arya Samaj philosophy was sort of a last resort also. So there's a kind of conversion politics there as well. So is there any kind of insight that maybe you can share around what is the contemporary significance on conversion based on your research? And then I'll just pose the question to Shrinidhi as well. This was a very specific question regarding Dharmapala. So regarding your reference to Dharmapala, I find it interesting how he is seen in India as a Buddhist revivalist, while in Sri Lanka, he's largely seen as a founder of the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. Critical Sri Lankan scholars also credit him with laying the foundations for Sinhala Buddhist supremacy, which is anti-Tamil and anti-Muslim and also seeks to conceal caste divisions in Sinhala Buddhist society. So do you see a difference in his approach to Buddhism and that of Das? It's actually a very, very interesting. He seems to have been picked up in different ways in different contexts. And again, sorry for posing two questions at the very last minute, but if you could give brief answers, we'd all appreciate it. Thank you. Do one of you want to go first? Shrinidhi, go ahead.
Go first.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just quickly. Yeah, actually, that's again. I should have also brought this up when the question of internationalism came up. This is also a very kind of salutary, like a very important lesson I think that we get from thinking about Ayodhya Das's and the Sakya Buddhist engagement with the broader Asian Buddhist world, which is that the same kind of circulation or sphere of ideas can have very different resonances and consequences in different places. So
Exactly.
you're absolutely right. Actually, the problem of caste-based divisions in the Sinhala Buddhist Nikayas was a very much a political issue and very urgent political issue in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And of course, Dharmapala has very, very complicated and complex legacies, in the plural for Sinhalese, for the history of Sinhalese Buddhism. So I think this is precisely the point, that when we think of, we must not make the mistake of simplifying the Dalit turn to Buddhism as only an emancipatory one. Of course, it was emancipatory. There's absolutely no denying that. But we must also acknowledge that engagement with Buddhism included certain kinds of, was very selective and strategic and historically contingent. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't one that was just unmediatedly emancipatory and liberatory in that sense. And I think the Dalit thinkers are also very much aware of this. Like one of the, of course, we all know Ambedkar's last text was the Buddha and his Dhamma. He also wrote a Pali dictionary. He actually learned Pali and authored a Pali dictionary in order to be able to read scripture himself. And so Dalit thinkers, I think, were very aware of their engagement with Buddhism being mediated by other schools of thought, like in this instance Dharmapala, and they, I think, tried as much as possible to engage with Buddhism on their own terms, and which is why I think Ayodhya Das's engagement with which is why Sakya Buddhism is so unique. But you're right that it's when we talk about this kind of larger contextualization, we must also talk about the problematic kind of histories and consequences that come with it.
Fantastic, thank you. Anish, do you want to have the last word?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah, actually, there was, although the Madras presidency had the largest number of Christians in British India, when it comes to Palakkad, Basel Mission was the only the Christian congregation or church in Palakkad. And there was also a Syrian Christian church in another place, and these were the only two the Christian religious institutions in Palakkad. So that is why the reason, the pastors had to come from, the Travancore, where the religious proselytization process was very very strong. And whereas in Travancore and Kochi, it was Dalits who mostly embraced Christianity compared to Ezhavas. Ezhavas also converted because there was no need, because they were in terms of socio-economic position, they were better off in Travancore and Travancore. So they did not have to embrace a new religion for the the rice pack kind of argument.
Mhm.
So they though we could see that if the minority of people was converting to Christianity in Travancore.
Thank you so much to all three of you and your superb papers and engagement with my questions, with the audience questions. Thank you to the audience for attending our second session, and we will be back in 30 minutes. Yes, for session number 3. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.